Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of American Criminal. In this season, slavery, people trafficking, fraud, and murder are just some of the things Sante Kimes did to get what she wanted. Listen to American Criminal Sante Kimes wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get ad-free access to the entire season first, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.
It's the summer of 1958 in Verdun, France. A 15-year-old American boy and his father reverently walk across the site of what was one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. The Battle of Verdun had taken place on the French Western Front between February and December of 1916 and had left 9 French towns in complete ruin. A French lieutenant had famously written of the battle, "Hell cannot be so terrible." The boy has visited a number of battlefields with his father, but something about this one feels different. "How many died, Dad?" "Hard to say exactly, son, but more than 500,000 were wounded or killed here. The battle lasted over 300 days. A lot of the French and German dead were never identified." The boy's father is a career military man, having served in Korea and Vietnam. Now stationed in Orléans, France, he's made it a point to expose his sons to the remnants of both world wars throughout the country. All right, let's move on. I want to show you something. It's a cemetery, but not like the ones you're used to seeing. They make their way to the Douaumont ossuary, a memorial building on the Verdun battlefield. Once inside, they head to a lower level. There, just beyond a pane of glass, the boy sees the bones of over 130,000 dead. The sight of skulls stacked on top of each other hits the boy in a way nothing ever has. Where'd they come from? Well, they found the bodies of these men rotting on the battlefield. Torn, blown apart. The bishop thought they deserved a better rest than that, so they built this memorial. All these people died in the battle? For what? Well, the freedoms you take for granted, son, they come at a price. They were paid for in blood. But they're ephemeral. Even in a country you think is invulnerable, it can all go away. Prosperity, safety, it's all fragile. So we have to think about how we stop it from happening. Soldiers are brave, but they can only do so much. It's up to others. It's up to leaders. We need leaders who can look forward, who can see challenges before they come, and be ready to meet those challenges head on. The boy stands there in silence. This visit to Verdun has been transformative. He can't put it into words just yet, but years later, when he looks back, he will think of this moment when he found that he had a clear purpose. All right. Well, come on, Newt. Let's go. Young Newt Gingrich follows his father out of the ossuary and back into the open French air. His plan for the future is already forming. Soon, he comes to believe that a free nation lives and dies by the choices of its elected officials. At the age of 15, Newt Gingrich would decide it was his duty to someday run for office and protect America's freedoms. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. In 1974 and 1976, Newt Gingrich lost his bid to become a United States congressman for Georgia's 6th District. He would later state that he never forgot the lessons he learned while visiting Verdun or the goals he had set for himself in the days following that trip. That's why he refused to let 2 failed elections deter him. Gingrich ran again in 1978 and won, and started what would be a 20-year career in Congress. Newt Gingrich quickly gained a reputation as a conservative firebrand and spent years building up a following in the House of Representatives. Finally, in 1994, he got his chance to truly lead. With Democratic President Bill Clinton struggling to find his footing, Gingrich, along with Texas Congressman Dick Armey, created the Republicans' Contract with America. The Contract with America was a unified legislative plan that promised smaller government, lower taxes, and welfare reform. The contract and Gingrich's surging popularity played an integral role in what would come to be known as the Republican Revolution. In the 1994 midterm elections, the GOP took control of the Senate from the Democrats and reclaimed the House for the first time in 40 years. Additionally, Republican newcomer George Nethercutt beat Democratic Speaker of the House and 30-year incumbent Tom Foley. It was the first time a sitting Speaker of the House had failed to win re-election since Galusha Grow in 1862. Gingrich had resurrected the Republican Party in Congress. And as the newly appointed Speaker of the House, he had no intention of letting President Clinton get in his way. The 1994 midterms devastated Bill Clinton. For a time, it seemed like Clinton, the man they called the comeback kid, would not recover. Gingrich and Congress were determined to push their agenda forward, with or without the Democrat in the White House. Many in the media covered Gingrich as though he were the true leader of the free world, and some started referring to the new crop of freshman Republican congressmen as Gingrich's children. The conservative wing of the Republican Party had first gained a foothold under President Ronald Reagan. 14 years later, by 1994, the conservative wing was quickly becoming the face of the party. Gingrich had once said his goal was to reshape the entire nation through the news media. Gingrich not only played to the 24-hour news networks and major papers, he tapped into the growing medium of conservative talk radio. Radio personality Rush Limbaugh had played a key role in getting the Republican message out during the midterm elections. Limbaugh was so important to the cause that freshman Republican congressmen had made him an honorary member and presented him with a copy of Gingrich's contract with America after they were sworn in. In late 1994, with the presidential contest looming, Gingrich called on Rush Limbaugh again. Gingrich hoped to foment anger towards the liberal elite and make Bill Clinton a one-term president. Gingrich's media assault was so effective that Gerald Manheim, professor of political communications at George Washington University, told the New York Times, "Gingrich is using his facility with the media to create a framework that is forcing Bill Clinton to react, but Clinton can't because his power base is decimated. Bill Clinton is Jell-O. Newt is the mold." To challenge Clinton, Gingrich and the GOP would turn to Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. But Dole was just the beginning of Clinton's troubles. He would have to overcome the fiery Speaker of the House, a suicide, and a sex scandal. Still, in spite of the seemingly impossible odds, in 1996, Clinton would remind the GOP and the American people that he was still worthy of his old nickname. This is episode 53, 1996, Clinton versus Dole, the comeback kid. In early 1995, Bill Clinton's prospects for re-election looked bleak. A year earlier, Paula Jones, a former Arkansas state employee, had claimed that then-Governor Bill Clinton sexually assaulted her in a hotel room years earlier. It was not the first accusation made against Bill Clinton. In the 1992 Democratic primary, Clinton had faced accusations of an affair with a woman named Jennifer Flowers. He had come away from the Jennifer Flowers scandal relatively unscathed, but a charge of sexual assault was very different. Bill Clinton's attorney Bob Bennett had done his best to get the Paula Jones case dismissed quickly. When that failed in May of 1994, Bennett had committed himself to stalling the case long enough to keep it from dogging Clinton on the campaign trail. Bennett had first argued that a sitting president couldn't be sued in a civil case. While the validity of that claim made its way through the courts, Bennett turned his focus to diminishing Paula Jones' credibility. In January of 1995, Penthouse magazine published an article titled "The Devil in Paula Jones" that featured old photos of a half-naked 19-year-old Paula Jones posing suggestively with her 31-year-old boyfriend. Then, members of Jones' own family went on national television to attack her version of events with the president. Additionally, Bob Bennett received raw footage from a shoot Paula Jones had done for a 1994 documentary called The Clinton Chronicles, an investigation into the alleged criminal activities of Bill Clinton. In the movie, produced by a Christian film company with the help of Reverend Jerry Falwell, Jones tells her story about her night in the hotel with Bill Clinton. The raw footage, most of which did not make the final cut, shows Paula Jones giggling at her story about Clinton, leering suggestively at the camera, and doing multiple takes of a well-choreographed kissing scene with her husband Steve Jones. Between the Penthouse article, the family attacks, and the video footage, Bennett believed he had enough evidence to make it so that Paula Jones would never want to appear before a jury. And for a time at least, Paula Jones' attorneys agreed. While the Paula Jones story wouldn't disappear, Bennett had done enough to keep it from being the primary focus of Clinton's upcoming campaign. But even as the Paula Jones story faded, Clinton still faced an uphill battle. House Speaker Newt Gingrich continued to control the national narrative. To hear Gingrich tell it, Bill Clinton had nothing to do with running the country. Seems Clinton felt the pressure from Gingrich's attacks. On April 18, 1995, Clinton held a primetime press conference at which he argued the president is relevant. For many in the media, that statement only showed how irrelevant Bill Clinton had become. Some pundits doomed him to be a one-term president. A Democrat hadn't won a second term since Franklin Roosevelt in the 40s, and they didn't think Bill Clinton would be the one to break the cycle. Then on April 19, 1995, the day following the president's press conference, tragedy struck. At 9:02 a.m., Timothy McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 and injuring over 680 people. It was one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in United States history. On April 23, 1995, President Bill Clinton traveled to Oklahoma City and delivered a speech at a memorial service for the victims of the bombing.
Today, our nation joins with you in grief. We mourn with you. We share your hope that some may still survive. We thank all those who have worked so heroically to save lives and to solve this crime, those here in Oklahoma and those who are all across this great land, and many who left their own lives to come here to work hand in hand with you. We pledge to do all we can to help you heal the injured, to rebuild this city, and to bring to justice those who did this evil.
Most viewed President Clinton's speech as a moment of leadership in a difficult time. Many in the media said it helped heal and comfort a mourning nation. And a number of pundits changed their tune, claiming the president was relevant after all. Indeed, following his speech in Oklahoma, Bill Clinton started to bounce back. Unfortunately for Clinton, another scandal was still hanging over his head. A bad real estate deal from the 1970s had come back to haunt him. What had started as an investigation into past financial transactions of Bill and Hillary Clinton had led to stories of disappearing documents, possible blackmail, threats, and inquiries into the suicide of one of the president's closest friends. The media might have lost its appetite for Paula Jones, but they couldn't get enough of Whitewater. It's 6 p.m. on Friday, May 26, 1995, in the Washington, D.C. offices of independent counsel Ken Starr. One of Starr's staff members, a 30-year-old attorney, is still hard at work. Starr's office had been tasked with investigating events surrounding the Whitewater case, a land development venture connected to Bill and Hillary Clinton that dates back to the 70s. Part of the young attorney's job is to reevaluate the 1993 suicide of Bill Clinton's friend and Deputy White House counsel Vince Foster. The attorney's phone rings. He answers, but before he can even say hello, the man on the other end of the line starts in.
Hey, this is Chris Ruddy.
Oh, come on, Chris. You've left me 12 messages in 2 days.
I'm working on a story, and I need to talk to you.
Chris Ruddy is a reporter for the conservative Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. He's been trying to get members of Ken Starr's staff to take his claims about Vince Foster seriously.
You're ignoring the facts, all of you.
The D.C. Police, the Senate Banking Committee, independent counsel Fisk, all these investigations reach the same conclusion, Chris. Foster committed suicide.
No, I don't think so. Listen, have you heard of Carolyn Huber?
Carolyn Huber is a personal aide to the Clintons. The attorney is about to snap, "Of course I've heard of Carolyn Huber, you idiot," but he takes a breath and stops himself. The independent counsel's office has recently come under fire for possible leaks to the press, so he avoids commenting on anything that could be tied to the case. "I'm not able to confirm whether I've heard of particular individuals because that might indicate whether they were involved in the investigation."
Look, I know Starr is doing his job, but he's not a prosecutor. And your other guy, Mark Toohey, is a left-winger, but he can be redeemed. Left-wingers might distrust police even more than conservatives, and that's good for this investigation. You need to see what's going on. This is what I was saying on the Gordon Liddy show. I know how the Vince Foster thing happened. It's a classic staged suicide.
Oh my God. What facts do you have, Chris? Because all I've heard on your messages is you spouting conspiracy theories about Vince Foster, Whitewater, Waco, Inslaw.
Inslaw, Whitewater, Waco? No, they're not connected to Foster. They're red herrings. You'll see. Look for my article next week.
Ruddy hangs up, and the attorney is left to laugh and wonder how calls like this have become a consistent part of his job. As the Whitewater case has progressed, it has attracted a growing number of conspiracy theories from ultra-right-wing groups and news outlets. The young attorney doesn't think the Clintons played a role in Vince Foster's suicide, or that there's been a vast cover-up. But his work on this angle of the case has convinced him that if his team keeps pulling all the threads connected to Whitewater, they will eventually find something that could bring Bill Clinton down. As he leaves his office for the night, he doesn't realize they're closer to cornering Clinton than they think, and that he, future Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, will play an integral role in the proceedings before it's all done. Ken Starr wasn't the first independent counsel to investigate the Whitewater Development Corporation. For 18 months prior, the original special counsel assigned to the case, Robert Fisk, had looked into the investments Bill and Hillary Clinton made along with their friends Jim and Susan McDougal. Fisk had investigated the possible real estate fraud, potential perjury, and Vince Foster's 1993 death. But when Ken Starr took over, his investigation not only reopened the Vince Foster case, but the case expanded into claims of blackmail, intimidation, and threats that could possibly link back to the Clintons or the McDougals. Ken Starr's chief deputy, Hickman Ewing Jr., had once said if they were going to investigate Whitewater, they needed to push over every rock in looking for the truth. By early summer of 1995, they had already pushed over so many rocks that some started to question whether Starr's investigation had gone beyond its purview. Still, Whitewater and Vince Foster stories remained a threat to the Clinton campaign. Some on the right believed his luck had finally run out, and this was a scandal Slick Willie, as Clinton was sometimes called, could not escape. But Clinton supporters knew better than to count out the comeback kid. As the summer of 1995 came to an end, Bill Clinton once again found new life. With the 90s tech boom underway, the burgeoning dot-com bubble fueled another rise in Clinton's popularity. But to win re-election, Clinton would have to convince the American people that 4 more years of Clinton rule was better than anything the Republicans had to offer. Kansas Senator and decorated World War II veteran Bob Dole had been President Gerald Ford's running mate in the 1976 election. After Ford and Dole lost to Democrats Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, Dole had returned to run in the GOP presidential primary in 1980. His campaign didn't last. He dropped out not long after the New Hampshire primary. Dole had run for president again in 1988 and had emerged as the biggest Republican primary challenger to eventual winner George H.W. Bush. So by 1995, Bob Dole had already run for president twice, was Senate Majority Leader, and was also 72 years old. If he was going to run for president again, he knew 1996 was likely his last chance. Bob Dole had announced his candidacy on April 10, 1995. The events in Oklahoma City had occurred a little more than a week later, so Dole held off on actively campaigning. When he did resume his campaign schedule, he found himself confronted with a crowded GOP primary. Former Nixon consultant Pat Buchanan, New Jersey businessman Steve Forbes, Texas Senator Phil Gramm, and several others. But after 30 years of service to the Republican Party, Dole believed it was his turn to get the nomination. His campaign, though, was finding it hard to get that message across. In May and June of 1995, Dole had gone after the lack of virtue in Hollywood and talked about how important character was for a president. If Clinton's position was as weak as it had been early in the year, a campaign based on morals and character might have been enough. But Clinton's popularity had only continued to rise, and Dole realized he needed help with his campaign. So in his hour of need, he turned to the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Dole had never especially liked or agreed with Gingrich. Later in life, he would say, Gingrich had a new idea every minute, and most of them were off the wall. But with the presidential election on the line, the Senate Majority Leader believed his best hope of rallying Republicans around him was to join forces with Gingrich. In the fall of 1995, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich would play the political version of a game of chicken. Unable to reach a compromise on the federal budget, the president and the Speaker of the House would inch the government closer and closer to a shutdown. A massive reduction in government services and closure of federal buildings and lands, and 800,000 government employees would find themselves temporarily unemployed. Unwilling to give in, Clinton and Gingrich would face off in private and in the media. While many Republicans and Democrats held out hope for a last-minute compromise, it would come down to a clash between the president and the speaker that would shape the 1996 election and mark the beginning of the end for more than one political career. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wiki Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. It's Wednesday, November 1st, 1995, in the White House. President Bill Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt, and several advisors await the arrival of Speaker Newt Gingrich and his Republican colleagues. For months, Clinton and the GOP congressional leadership have been at an impasse over the federal budget. Communications Director George Stephanopoulos preps the president just moments before the confrontation. So, Mr. President, Newt will lie, and Newt will leak to force your hand. Remember, in this case, a failed meeting is a successful meeting. Al, what do you think? I think George is exactly right. Clinton and Gingrich have had multiple private phone calls in an attempt to negotiate. The two men, while political enemies, respect each other's intellect, and their conversations have often veered off topic into friendly territory. These calls have alarmed some members of the administration who fear Clinton will give up too much to Gingrich, and they've asked the president to no longer talk with him without others present. When Gingrich and members of Republican leadership arrive, the meeting is tense from the start. Mr. President, can we talk about these ads the Democrats are running that claim we're going to cut Medicare? Basically saying we're a bunch of crazy zealots, going to rob old ladies and give money to the rich? Before Clinton has a chance to answer, Vice President Gore intercedes. Mr. Speaker, you don't have clean hands. You accuse the Democrats of somehow being responsible for a mentally ill woman drowning her own children. Al Gore is referring to the story of Susan Smith, a woman who admitted to drowning her children in a South Carolina lake. Gingrich had responded to the incident by saying her act was proof of a sick society, and the only way to fix it was to vote Republican. Gingrich doesn't respond. Gore's attack has put him on his heels, and it emboldens President Clinton. Newt, we've negotiated in good faith, and we're getting nothing from it. Mr. President, my followers would love nothing more than an ongoing showdown with the White House. But if you agree to our 7-year balanced budget plan using our numbers, which you know have been vetted, we can avoid any more conflict over this. I've agreed in principle to most of the Republican agenda, Newt. Looking at welfare reform, saving Medicare, balancing the budget, but your side hasn't compromised on a single issue. I'm done making concessions. You know, Mr. President, the problem here is you got a gun to my head. It's called the veto. But what you don't understand is that I've got a gun to your head too, and I'm going to use it. I'm going to shut down the government. After the meeting, and the room is clear, Clinton is rattled. He turns to his advisors. Jesus Christ, is he going to do this? Do you really think he's going to do it? House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt turns to the president. Yes, been trying to tell you this for days. They're going to do this. This is what they came to Washington to do. It's why they've been elected. Following the meeting, both sides went into PR mode. Each tried to cast the other as the reason behind the failed talks and the impending shutdown. On November 11th, 1995, in his weekly radio address, Bill Clinton spoke directly to the American people regarding the situation.
Think of it this way, my fellow Americans. Imagine the Republican Congress as a banker and the United States as a family that has to go to the bank for a short-term loan for a family emergency. The banker says to the family, I'll give you the loan, but only if you'll throw the grandparents and the kids out of the house first. Well, speaking on behalf of the family, I say, no thanks.
Bill Clinton vetoed the Republican bill. He said Republican proposals would cause Medicare premiums to skyrocket. He said their massive cuts to education and environmental protections were untenable. He said he was willing to lose the presidency rather than agree to their budget. Newt Gingrich stuck to his word. As the clock struck midnight on November 14, 1995, the United States government shut down and over 750,000 non-essential federal employees were furloughed. Democrats and Republicans again went directly to the media to argue their side. Neither party would take responsibility for what many Americans viewed as a colossal failure of leadership. At 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the first day of the shutdown, Republicans, including Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole, held a press conference. Gingrich spoke first and almost immediately attacked Clinton.
He talked about cuts in Medicare, which I think is just almost tragic to have a president of the United States so deliberately misinform and frighten senior citizens. But because he can't win the argument between spending more and spending a whole lot more, he has to try to create a phony argument about fantasy cuts that do not exist in order to frighten people about problems that aren't real.
But any leverage Newt Gingrich gained from the press conference disappeared on the second day of the shutdown. On the morning of November 15, 1995, Gingrich attended a breakfast hosted by the Christian Science Monitor. Instead of sticking to the Republican talking points he had largely established, he told reporters a story about a flight he'd taken on Air Force One. Earlier in November, Gingrich had joined an American delegation that flew to Israel for the funeral of slain Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Gingrich complained to the reporters at the breakfast that on the flight back to the United States, he'd expected to talk to President Clinton about the budget, but he and Bob Dole had been asked to sit at the back of the plane. Gingrich said, "This is petty, but you landed Andrews and you've been on the plane for 25 hours and nobody has talked to you and they ask you to get off the plane by the back ramp. You just wonder, where is their sense of manners? Where is their sense of courtesy?" Then Gingrich made a mistake and he delivered an inadvertent gift to President Clinton and the Democrats, saying the Air Force One flight was part of the reason why he had sent such a tough bill to the president in regards to the budget. The backlash was immediate. Democrats and journalists accused Newt Gingrich of causing a federal shutdown because of a perceived personal slight. Gingrich argued he was only pointing out that the president had avoided negotiating with him, but the battle was already lost. The day after the president, the New York Daily News printed a caricature of Gingrich on the cover. In it, Gingrich was portrayed as a diapered baby holding a bottle and throwing a tantrum beneath the headline, "Crybaby." The image stuck, and soon polls indicated almost twice as many Americans blamed the shutdown on Gingrich and the Republicans than on Clinton and the Democrats. Just like that, Bill Clinton's chances of re-election got a massive boost, and the rise of Newt Gingrich came to an abrupt end. In a Rolling Stone article titled "Newt Gingrich, Dead Man Talking," William Grider would write, "For some months afterward, the speaker literally disappeared from action, was ridiculed by Democrats as Phantom Newt, and seldom showed up on the House floor for debates. He turned legislative management over to other GOP leaders." After the 1998 midterms, Newt Gingrich would resign from Congress and end his career as a politician. Senate Majority Leader and Republican primary candidate Bob Dole had ceded control of budget negotiations with the White House to Newt Gingrich. Dole's connection to Gingrich and the shutdown delivered a blow to the presumptive nominee's hopes of mounting a competitive race in the general election. And as the shutdown stretched through November and then into December, American support of Republican leadership continued to dwindle. On December 31, 1995, Bob Dole had finally had enough. He made an address from the Senate floor.
And we ought to end this. I mean, it's gotten to the point where it's a little ridiculous as far as this senator is concerned. So we're going to keep trying. And hopefully on Tuesday, if we can't do anything else, we may pass whatever it takes on the Senate side.
Dole's message to other Republicans was clear. The fight was over and it was time to reopen the government. The following week, on January 6, 1996, the shutdown came to an end. And while approval ratings on both sides had certainly taken a hit, Bill Clinton arguably came out on top. In 1992, Bill Clinton had run as a young upstart who wanted to usher in a new generation of leadership. His campaign staff had reflected that attitude. Headed by James the Ragin' Cajun Carville, the Clinton camp had been brash and ready for a campaign fight. This time around, though, Clinton took a different approach. Working with a Republican-led Congress throughout 1995 had altered some of Clinton's views on governing. He'd tapped his longtime friend and advisor from his Arkansas governor days, Dick Morris, to head up his campaign. Morris had come up with a strategy he called triangulation. At its core, triangulation was meant to put Clinton directly in the middle between the left and the right. In order to accomplish that, Clinton would have to adopt some policies that typically would have been presented and supported by his Republican opponents. On the campaign trail, Clinton leaned heavily into deregulating the economy and reducing big government. But the power Dick Morris wielded over the Clinton campaign didn't sit well with some of his colleagues on the left, and it riled at least one member of Clinton's '92 campaign. Years later, James Carville would be asked to describe, without naming names, his least favorite person in Washington. Carville would reply, "There is nothing appealing about him at all. The rule prohibits me to disclose names, but his initials are Dick Morris." Despite animosity towards Morris from certain Democrats and campaign staffers, Bill Clinton, the centrist, was doing quite well. By March of 1996, according to Gallup polls, Clinton already had a 14-point lead nationally over presumptive Republican nominee Bob Dole. But the polls weren't Bob Dole's only concern. In the spring of 1996, even as he started to separate himself from the Republican primary pack, Dole was still struggling to shake off the negative effects of the shutdown and the perception that he was connected to Newt Gingrich and the so-called neoconservatives in the GOP. So in order to distance himself from the neocons and focus his energy on becoming president, Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole resigned from Congress after 30 years of service. On June 11, 1996, he gave his farewell speech from the Senate floor.
So the Bible tells us to everything there is a season, and I think my season in the Senate is about to come to an end. But the new season before me makes this moment far less the closing of one chapter than the opening of another. And we all take pride in the past, but we all live for the future. And I agree with the prairie poet Carl Sandburg, who told us, "Yesterday is a wind gone down. A sun dropped in the west. I tell you that there's nothing in the world, only an ocean of tomorrows, a sky of tomorrows."
As the party conventions approached, both campaigns would kick into high gear. In addition to trailing badly in the polls, Bob Dole would face a perceived age problem and a very real Ross Perot problem. For Bill Clinton, re-election would finally start to look like it was guaranteed. But once again, a sex scandal would threaten his prospects for victory. Only this time, the scandal wouldn't involve the president. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's Thursday, August 22, 1996, in Washington, D.C. Clinton campaign manager Dick Morris is a busy man. He spends his weekdays in Washington working on the campaign and then heads back to his home in Connecticut to spend time with his wife on the weekends. With the Democratic National Convention less than a week away, his schedule has been even more hectic than usual. He's glad to finally have a night off to relax in his home away from home, a suite at the Jefferson, an upscale boutique hotel less than a mile away from the White House. And he's excited to have a special guest tonight. Well, did you bring her? Yes, Dick, I told you I would. 37-year-old Sherry Rowland steps into the hotel room, and a very excited Yorkshire Terrier trots in behind her. Dick Morris's face lights up, and he crouches down to pet the dog. I've been wanting to meet her since you told me you got her. I'm so glad I did. Isn't she sweet? I've even been thinking about possible names. What about bijou? It means jewel in French. Oh, I like that. Roland steps further into the room and makes herself at home. So how was the White House? Any more talk about life on Mars? Morris laughs. Roland loves to hear stories about his work at the White House, and Morris loves telling them. No, nothing as exhilarating as Mars this week, but everything's set for the feature in Time. Should come out right before the convention. Well, congratulations, Dick. That's exciting. The president wasn't particularly pleased that Time was going to have my face on the cover during the week of the convention, so I called the managing editor. He said they make the president the focus of the cover, but still find a way to put me on there. Some of the campaign staff are pissed they're writing about me at all. I'm sure they're just jealous. You mind if I let her out on the balcony? No, go ahead. Sherry Rowlands opens the door to the balcony and steps outside. Dick Morris follows her, and so does the little dog. Once on the balcony, Morris and Rowlands kiss, and he gropes her. A few minutes later, they're back inside and on the bed. Dick Morris doesn't think anything of it. It's a routine he and Sherry Rowlands have acted out countless times. Rowlands is Dick's favorite call girl, and he's seen her every week for the past year. But this time, there's someone watching. Sherry has sold her story to the tabloid magazine Star. Their photographer is stationed on the roof nearby, and he got the shot. The following week, Time's feature story on Dick Morris titled "The Man Who Has Clinton's Ear" came out. When the Clinton team arrived in Chicago ahead of the Democratic National Convention, Morris was the talk of the town. Bill Clinton looked unstoppable, and many people believed Dick Morris was the man who had made it happen. Morris didn't disagree. In the Time article, he was quoted as saying, "I was deeply honored to help this president come back from being buried in a landslide and to make it possible for him to have a second chance at a second term." But Dick Morris's moment of triumph wouldn't last long. By the time the Democratic Convention kicked off on August 26, 1995, rumors of a possible exposé about Morris and a prostitute had already begun to circulate. Whispers of what would come to be known by many as Dick Morris's toe-sucking scandal quickly reached the administration. What could be even worse than the affair, from a political perspective, was the fact that the woman was claiming Morris shared government information with her. Dick Morris denied the allegations to Press Secretary Mike McCurry, but it was clear the story wasn't going away. And with Morris the new face of the campaign, people inside the administration grew concerned about how the story would reflect on the president. No one was sure if Bill Clinton could survive yet another scandal. On Wednesday, August 28, 1996, while Bill Clinton watched coverage of the Democratic Convention from his hotel room, members of Clinton's staff told the president something would have to be done about Dick Morris. It seems Clinton agreed. Early in the morning of August 29th, the final day of the Democratic National Convention, Morris resigned. A week later, Time would feature Morris on the cover again. The magazine would publish a picture of Morris and his wife with the heading, "After the Fall." By midday of August 29, 1995, Dick Morris had already headed back home to Connecticut. Bill Clinton's staff moved quickly and managed the Morris issue with a deft hand, insulating the president from potential fallout. They worked hard to ensure Morris's scandal didn't lead to a rehash of the Jennifer Flowers scandal, the Paula Jones scandal, or even Whitewater. No comment, or that's a personal matter for Dick Morris, were the standard responses. And while the Clinton White House was managing the fallout of the Dick Morris scandal behind the scenes, Bill Clinton took center stage at the United Center in Chicago to accept the Democratic presidential nomination.
I love and revere the rich and proud history of America, and I am determined to take our best traditions into the future. But with all respect, we do not need to build a bridge to the past. We need to build a bridge to the future.
Bill Clinton's speech was a direct response to the acceptance speech Bob Dole had given at the Republican National Convention in San Diego 2 weeks prior. After former football player and Bush Secretary of Housing Jack Kemp had accepted the vice presidential nomination, Dole had closed out the convention. In his speech, he had also talked about building a bridge, but his bridge didn't lead to the future.
Let me be the bridge to an America that only the unknowing call myth. Let me be the bridge to a time of tranquility, faith, and confidence in action. And to those who say it was never so, that America has not been better, I say you're wrong. And I know because I was there, and I have seen it, and I remember.
The contrast in the two speeches highlighted one of the main issues the Dole campaign had faced from the onset. If Dole were to win the election, he would be 73 years old at inauguration. Images of Bill Clinton jogging through Washington, D.C. and spending time with his teenage daughter Chelsea were commonplace. At 50, he was still viewed in political circles as a young man. Dole, on the other hand, was seen by many as a remnant from another era. Wounds he'd suffered in World War II had rendered Dole's right arm essentially unusable. To avoid embarrassment, Dole, the politician, started clasping a pen in his right hand back in the early 60s. He'd found that when people saw the pen, they were less likely to try and shake his disabled right hand. And while images of Dole and his pen reminded voters he was a war hero, they also reminded them of his age. Age wasn't Dole's only issue. There was also Ross Perot, the Texas businessman who some claimed upended the 1992 election as an independent candidate. In 1996, Perot had entered the race as a member of the Reform Party. But unlike in 92, Ross Perot's 96 campaign had remained on the periphery. Perot's polling numbers rarely reached double digits throughout the campaign. Perhaps even more devastating to his 96 run was the fact that he hadn't met the criteria laid out by the Commission on Presidential Debates that would deem him a candidate with a realistic chance of winning and earn him a spot on the debate stage. Despite that, Perot still had a vocal group of followers, and Bob Dole wanted them in his camp. The Dick Morris scandal hadn't done anything to slow Bill Clinton's momentum, and with only 2 weeks left before the election, Bob Dole found himself trailing far behind in the polls. Dole believed if he could get Ross Perot to drop out of the race and endorse him, it could provide a much-needed boost to his faltering campaign. So on October 24, 1995, Dole dispatched campaign manager Scott Reed to try to convince Perot to drop out. Perot refused. In a last-ditch effort to climb back into the race and prove that he was up for the job, 72-year-old Bob Dole finished his 1996 campaign with a 96-hour marathon. For 4 straight days, Dole traveled across the country and campaigned 24/7. He talked to crowds at sunrise, and he held speaking engagements well after midnight. He found moments to sleep on buses and short plane flights, but that was it. And by the end, his voice was shot, and he was exhausted. The marathon was a valiant physical effort on the part of Bob Dole, but had little effect. On November 5, 1996, President Bill Clinton won re-election, beating Bob Dole 379 to 159 in the Electoral College. Clinton took 49.2% of the popular vote to Dole's 41. Ross Perot secured about 9% of the popular vote, which was half of what he'd earned in 92. But Perot wasn't the only minor candidate on the ballot in 96. Green Party nominee Ralph Nader won just over 685,000 votes. While this 0.71% of the popular vote barely registered, Nader would return in 2000 and have a much more meaningful impact. But despite Clinton's victory, the Democrats failed to take back the House or the Senate, perhaps signaling that Bill Clinton was more popular than his party. Clinton's victory made him the first Democrat to achieve a second term since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He would enter his second term on a high note, but the celebration would be cut short. The Whitewater investigation had continued to expand well beyond its initial intention, and soon it would lead Ken Starr's team to a story about a young White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. A member of Starr's staff, Brett Kavanaugh, would put together a list of explicit questions he believed the president should be forced to answer about Lewinsky. And the comeback kid would finally get ensnared in a scandal that had sticking power. This is episode 53 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1996, The Comeback Kid. On the next episode, the 2000 election. With Bill Clinton's tenure as president coming to an end, Vice President Al Gore takes up the mantle for the Democrats. Gore tries to distance himself from the Clinton scandals, while Republicans look to the son of a former president to get them back in the White House. But in November of 2000, Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush find themselves embroiled in one of the most controversial presidential elections in modern history. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get her half of history, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Michael Federico. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
In 1998, a Manhattan socialite disappeared from her mansion on the Upper East Side. After a brief investigation into the crime, detectives zeroed in on one woman, Sante Kimes. As the police and media looked into the story, they couldn't believe the rap sheet of the person they just picked up. Slavery, people trafficking, fraud, murder? What would drive someone to all of that? Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the true crime history podcast American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, the life and crimes of a woman so obsessed with wealth that she'd do just about anything to get it. Listen to American Criminal Sante Kimes wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.